welcome to another one of the Reupload Music Academy Tokyo lectures. On the couch next to me is, people like to use the phrase a DJ's DJ, but I like the phrase a people's DJ. It's Ben UFO.
Hello.
I think it's good that we're starting the talk today by the fact that we all got to see you play last night. So at least some people have a sense of what Ben's about as a DJ, and it's not just all a theoretical talk about playing records. But even though last night was a success and everyone really enjoyed themselves, I think it's quite interesting that your very start of your story, success, was born of a slight failure. Do you mind telling us about how you started DJing and what the story behind that was?
So I'd been DJing for quite a long time. Went to university, met a couple of people there that I started DJing with, and we decided to try and get a radio show. Radio is something that I've done pretty much every week for the past 7 years. But yeah, we were turned down for the first show that we applied to, which was just like a tiny student union radio station who more or less told us that what we were doing was completely irrelevant to anything that they were interested in. So we kind of just applied to an internet station instead and started broadcasting from our bedrooms. And that was kind of the beginning of everything for us.
And to give a bit of context for those who aren't from the UK, where were you all at the time and how did you all come together musically?
So I grew up in London. All of us met properly in Leeds, where we went to university. I met David, Pearson Sound, in the queue for Forward in London. Transpired that he was going to come up to the same university as me, so we got talking and he started sending me some of his first tracks, which were pretty bad. And I ended up living with Kev in second year. He was the only person that I knew in Leeds that had a pair of turntables, which were set up on the floor of his room. So we'd like spend a couple of hours mixing like sort of like terrible, well, alternately terrible and all right drum and bass records. He played the bad ones, like kneeling on the floor next to his bed. It was quite strange. We kind of discovered dubstep at like a relatively similar time, and yeah, started going out to nights together, and that was that.
So I find it interesting that your relationship with the dubstep scene and music, you're from London, but you were staying in Leeds at the time. For the sake of context, the dubstep scene and sound in the UK was born of a very small pool of people, producers and DJs and club promoters. Very few venues would play it, and it was a very narrow kind of geography as a sound in South London. How did you experience that early on by being a London expat in Leeds, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It was a really hyper-specific sound that initially was only really played in like a few rooms around London. Gradually spread a little bit. Bristol, Leeds was one of the other cities that it spread to relatively quickly. But yeah, I mean, we very much felt like outsiders not being in London. Like I would come back home, go to as many nights as possible, and try and meet people, but it still felt like we weren't really in the heart of what was going on. And certainly when we started DJing, we were just coming at it from the perspective of fans and people that really liked the music and wanted to play it. There was no sort of desire to get involved because we didn't feel like that was possible, really. It was something that was happening somewhere else. So, I mean, we started to put nights on, we started doing this radio show, but it wasn't a scene that we were sort of involved with. We weren't kind of in the middle of it. We were somewhere parallel. And
I find it interesting that your first radio show was named after a lofa tune, Roughage. So it's all very slavish towards the dubstep sound. But interestingly, once you started the radio show, people started sending in tracks. Could you explain a little bit about the relationship between your listeners and the radio show in Leeds once these tracks started to roll in?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, we were very much just kind of fans of this music. So when people started to send us music that they were writing for the show, it it sort of made me feel as though there were these little pockets of people around the world that felt the same way that we did. And that was kind of the first idea. That was the first thing that kind of gave me an idea that what we were doing might be slightly broader than I thought, might have like more of a relevance to other people than I thought. I think because we felt slightly outside of the scene at the time, we also felt able to draw from a slightly wider pool of music, which maybe made what we were doing relevant to more people. I think that's probably why we developed the regular core of listeners that we did, and I think that's why those listeners started sending us music to play on the show. And
once this music started to roll in, I'm interested in how people talk about the Hessle sound and the roughage sound. And once these tracks started getting sent in, did you start to see patterns of what sort of music was coming in that was influenced by dubstep that you thought, hang on, this is something completely new that we should pick up on?
I mean, like, do people in the room kind of know the records that we've released? I don't really know how to answer that question until I kind of know whether or not people have heard the tracks. Like the stuff that we were playing on the radio was, at the time, was kind of falling between dubstep, garage, and stuff that was maybe a bit houseier and like faster techno that we were hearing that was fitting in with that sound. And the music that our listeners were sending in was very much informed by that. I think we were being sent quite a lot of predominantly garage-influenced music, which wasn't particularly big in London at the time. And the first record that we put out is a really good example of that. I think it was coming at a slightly different angle to most of the other stuff that was coming out.
I think we should play it, actually. I think we should play the first track on Hessle Audio. It's TRG, It Put You Down, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
This, for the sake of context, this was released in 2007. So this is kind of happening at a very interesting crossroads in the dubstep sound. So yeah, we'll let you hear it and then you can understand what we're talking about. I really like the attention to detail of killing the track. You didn't just switch it off. It's a DJ. So yeah, that's a TRG Put You Down, which was the first release on Hessle Audio, which is the label that you started with David and Kev, who are Pearson Sound and Pangea. Pearson Sound then was Ramadan Man early on. A lot of what gets discussed with Hessle Audio as it started as a sound was that it was a label born of a very interesting time in dubstep and what UK dance music and generally was doing that was the start of the UK funky sound. House music was starting to come into what dubstep was doing, and 2007 was also the year that dubstep started getting put on festival stages. So in terms of UK music, dubstep was at a real crossroads. How do you think Hessle kind of tackled that early on?
I mean, it was very much born of its time. Like you said, 2007 is it was a time where a lot of different stuff was happening. The music was kind of exploding in a way that it hadn't before. The sound was changing. It was broadening, getting more festival friendly, like you said. But I think, like most importantly, that like there was just a lot of momentum behind it. So, I mean, if you're trying to get involved with a scene that is expanding, it's obviously going to be a little bit easier. There's going to be infrastructure there to help you out. For us, we were lucky enough to find a distributor that was willing to work with like 19-year-olds that had no idea what they were doing. Like we wrote a sort of really innocent sounding letter, I think, to ST Holdings, who distributed us for a long time, who recently closed. It was David that took the initiative to do that. But they just guided us through the whole process, held our hand through the whole thing, which is something that I think wouldn't happen if you were trying to get involved in something that was already established, already massive, already slightly saturated. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't that we were so much tackling what was going on. We were just fans that wanted to get involved, and it so happened that we were in the right place to do it because there was an infrastructure in place to help us.
And once the label started to pick up a little bit of momentum as well, what was like the chronology of you being in Leeds? Because everybody thinks of dubstep as London and Bristol in the UK as the big cities. But for the sake of the context of dubstep and what you were doing in the kind of diaspora of UK dance music, what was the Leeds scene like, and how did you feel that influenced what you were doing?
I mean, the Leeds scene was tiny. The way that it started was in back rooms of bigger raves at a place called the West Indian Centre, which was sort of a big cultural centre in Chapeltown. And you'd have sort of either bigger drum and bass acts or dub reggae sound systems in the main room, dubstep in the back room. I mean, most importantly, both sound systems, like in the main room and in the second room, would be absolutely amazing. So you could be confident that you could go and see this music that was produced in a hyper-specific way and really feel it the way that it was designed to be felt. So, I mean, from that perspective, it was a really great place to go out and listen to the music. But the sort of core community of listeners and fans wasn't quite there till slightly later. I think the fact that the music was being played in sort of big dub reggae back rooms gave the nights a slightly different feel as well. In London, most of the places to listen to this music would be sort of small basement clubs like Plastic People, places like Mass, Third Base, which were all like small capacity one-room venues. So yeah, I mean, it definitely did have a different feel, and that's probably impacted on what we've done.
And in terms of you DJing as well, again, like the dynamic with Hessle, you're like the non-producer in the trio. You shouldn't be embarrassed by that at all. Like, once you started playing this music out on the radio, I always really liked. I know you're a fan of Bailey,
yeah.
The DJ on 1Extra, and he has this running phrase that I really like. He's like, he blocks out what people thinks is cool. Once dubstep started to get cool, as it were, and you were DJing the Hessle records out, how do you feel the relationship changed as a DJ between the radio and the club at this point?
I think, for me, radio was always the way that I accessed this music first and foremost, so it was always kind of a solitary thing, I suppose. I didn't start to play out until considerably later, probably around 2006-07. And the places that I was playing were tiny spots for friends. There was a place in London that I think David talked about in his lecture a few years ago called the Red Star in Camberwell, which was a sort of small community event in Camberwell that would happen on Thursday evenings, and it would basically be like friends DJing for each other. So that, I mean, those were my initial experiences of DJing. When the label started to pick up and we started to get busier, that was then like something I had to come to terms with, I guess. Like I had to figure out sort of what it actually was that I wanted to present to people. I mean, like you said, I'm the only one of the three that doesn't produce. DJing in and of itself is quite a sort of niche, specific thing, so it seems like a strange thing to specialise in. But I do seem to be able to endlessly pick over what I do and sort of overanalyze it constantly. That's still something that I do too much, I think.
I think it works to your benefit. Speaking of the other elements of the trio, do you think we could play a track from a Ramadan Man?
Yeah, sure. We picked a tune called Don't Change for Me, didn't we? This came out in, I think, 2010, 2011. I think so, yeah.
Still love this track. It's so So that's probably about 3 years into the label, so that's 2010. A lot of what gets talked about in UK dance music is the idea of it being a continuum, that one genre leads directly into another in some kind of historical lineage, and things have a domino effect. And I think what's really interesting about a track like that is that I feel that could have been made this year or next quite easily. I mean, I'm not a producer, but I think there's a lot of nodding faces in the room. It seems to be a really interesting melting down of all these ghosts of UK classic UK electronic music genres in a way that is still quite pertinent without sounding too retro. That's my take on it anyway. What I find interesting about it in turn is how you managed to frame these tracks in such a way that it was speaking to what was happening at the time, but like the DJ Bailey idea, trying to block out what's cool. I'm curious about what you think about this idea of UK dance music and your place within it being part of a lineage of something.
I mean, like both of the tracks that we've played so far have been quite sort of explicitly backward-looking. I think even if they sound contemporary, like the TRG tune was really explicitly referencing two-step tracks and kind of records by people like Horsepower, Artwork, and LB. David's tune is obviously completely enthralled to sort of classic jungle records. Use of the breakbeat, the like just kind of constant little references to different periods of UK dance music, like you said. We've never wanted to release anything that is sort of wholly nostalgic for something else. So I hope that both of those records sound like a slightly more modern spin on those two things. I mean, they're both like getting on a bit now, both of those two tracks, but hopefully they don't sound like fully retro, if that makes sense. All of us are really interested in the history of UK music, so I think that it does have a really big impact on the music that we release. Like you said, there's this idea of the hardcore continuum, tracing through UK music from the late 80s to now, through acid house, you know, all of the various brands of garage, jungle, up to dubstep and grime. It's a little bit, the lines are a little bit more blurred now. It's slightly less clear what's going on. And I think that's actually reflected in the music that we're releasing at the moment. The music we're releasing now, I don't think is as explicitly backward looking. I don't exactly know where it fits in, but that's something that I'm quite interested in. I quite like the idea of releasing music that's slightly alien, that no one can quite place, but that still fits within existing dance music conventions. I think the value in looking at an idea like the hardcore continuum is that it gives you an idea of what kinds of conventions of the dance floor might be worth holding on to, and it might also give you an idea of how it might be fun to subvert them if that's something that interests you. I mean,
it does interest us, that's why we're talking about it.
Yeah.
But when you are talking about what you'd like to hold on to and what you'd like to subvert, as a DJ, what would you like to do in those regards? What do you think is possible to do?
I mean, it's definitely not a thing that like everyone is fully interested in doing, because there is so much music that fits very, very comfortably within existing sort of parameters of genre and stuff like that. I'm not particularly interested in playing sets or releasing music that does fall really comfortably within those parameters, and I think it comes from our perspective as kind of outsiders to the various scenes that we've been involved with. Like you said, being in Leeds when dubstep was going on, coming into DJing house and techno with a background that's more sort of, you know, garage and dubstep and blah, blah, blah. So I think we've always felt the freedom to sort of play around with whatever genres we might be interested in at the time, because I don't think we've really felt the pressure to live up to the expectations of genre, because we've never really been welcomed into any. I hope that answers the question.
No, it's a difficult kind of idea. I think I should probably have prefaced that a little bit better. When I say this idea of a hardcore continuum, I think one of the preconceptions of it now is that UK dance music lives in a bubble, and that it only feeds into and of itself, when actually it was born of US house and techno music, and essentially, if I can boil down quite a complicated idea, is how the UK music diaspora managed to involve themselves in it. So what I quite like the idea of you challenging is in how you managed to fold in the traditions of US house and techno with things like garage and grime and even bassline kind of stuff, like the latter kind of things. Within that idea of what you'd like to subvert and what you'd like to change, when it comes to playing music on the radio and playing music on the dance floor, do you think there is a disparity between the two?
Possibly. I guess to go back to what you were saying about the hardcore continuum, I think these ideas are super useful in that they do allow you to draw a line through eras and pick out patterns and things like that. But with ideas like that are essentially really broad generalizations, generalizations that are made because they're useful, but they are still generalizations. So there are still tons of exceptions to these ideas and tons of little, tiny little flaws within the idea. And I find those flaws quite interesting. So if you broadly sum up US house and techno in a certain way, I'm quite interested in finding the people that don't comfortably fit within those parameters, and trying to figure out why it is that they've managed to make it work despite the fact that they're kind of operating at a tangent to what everyone thinks they should be doing. I'm always interested in finding UK producers that seem to pull in their influences from the States or from somewhere else, because like you said, there is this idea that somehow UK music exists in a bubble and UK producers only look to other UK producers for their inspiration and their ideas. And we know that's not true. I mean, when we listen to garage records, you can pick out tons of ideas from US rap and R&B and all that kind of stuff. But for the simplicity of the idea of this continuum, it makes sense just to kind of lock it into place. So yeah, I mean, I think that does inform my ideas about what I'd like to do as a DJ and what I'd quite like to do with the label. I'm quite interested in trying to be one of those people that can find slightly different ways of doing things and that can subvert the kind of established narratives around the music that we're involved with.
I think another thing that's really interesting about that, when you say trying to pull in a bank of knowledge as a DJ, I think one of the interesting things about this idea of a continuum is that the idea of being eclectic and what that means as a DJ. And I don't know what other people think of this, but I think it's quite strange how the word eclectic as a DJ automatically assumes you're educated about music, that you have a wealth of knowledge about various things, and that implies that you're inherently good at what you do. And I think as a DJ, this is quite an interesting a dichotomy, because when people say eclectic, you can say eclectic as knowledgeable, but a DJ in a student union bar can be eclectic. It doesn't imply equality. And I wonder what you think about the relationship between eclecticism and specialising.
So, again, it's quite complicated. I think we were having a conversation about this yesterday. I think for emerging scenes that have a newness about them, that are kind of unique and fresh and vital in that way that dubstep was, in that way that grime was, in that way that two-step garage was. Specialism is really, really important, because it's that specialism that allows the music to unravel, and develop. So with genre like dubstep, there was, DJs, Hatcher and Youngster, who both produced occasional records but were essentially specialist DJs, and they put a lot of initially quite disparate music into context as being one thing, and it was that really sort of honed the sound and made it what it was, and it helped people identify with it, I think. It made the music less sort of unpenetrable or something. I don't think that I'm that kind of DJ at all, because like I said, I've never really been an insider to those kinds of scene workings. But I really admire DJs that do that. You're talking about specialism and eclecticism. I think a lot of the time, like you said, that narrative is a massive oversimplification. DJs like Hatcher and Youngster, like they might have done something really hyper-specific, but they obviously have like a wealth of knowledge to draw on, and it's that underlies their specialism. So I don't think anyone should be afraid to really go in on what they're doing and, you know, really sort of hone it and perfect it, because there is obviously an enormous amount of value in that just kind of wild eclecticism and, you know, picking and choosing from a million different areas aimlessly. You know, I mean, that's like a completely false binary, but, you know, I think there's value in both specialism and eclecticism, basically.
Speaking of Hatcher and Youngster, we've got a bit from a Youngster set that you found especially like inspiring. Just going to play like a short blend so that people who aren't familiar with the style of dubstep DJing, when Youngster was basically the god.
Yeah.
So we're going to play a bit of that. What kind of time period was this one from?
Well, so this was like 2005 when I was 19. I don't know if people are familiar with like sort of pirate radio convention and stuff, but there's like MC hosting on this set, which kind of yeah, I mean you'll see what it sounds like. There's a couple of blends in there. You'll hear the sort of sound of the FM broadcast. Yeah, it is quite evocative of London at the time, I think. Oh, and it's from Rinse FM, which is the station that I DJ on as well.
I want 5 on the net. It's big.
Yeah.
I'll tight Zimmy for the last. Hold tight management. Hold tight Ham. The up Carla. What you got for them, youngster? Who likes this? Who's feeling? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And we're moving.
A round of applause for Youngster, I guess. Yeah. Now, it may seem a little bit strange to play a segment of a DJ set in a talk about a DJ that is not the recording, but I think it's interesting to listen to a set like Youngster and try and understand what you mean by a specialist DJ, in the sense that he didn't actually play that many tracks there, but he did a lot with it, which I think is what I think you mean by specialism as a DJ, right?
I mean, yeah, like in a sense, I think with Youngster it was always more about pacing and maintaining a certain atmosphere and vibe. Like he really did take specialism to sort of extremes. Like in those days, he was only playing music by 4 or possibly 5 producers across 2-hour sets, and that was all he was interested in. I think he would really criticize people that would come in and give him music as well. And when eventually he did expand the pool of producers whose music he was playing, you could really hear that he'd spent a lot of time grooming them and speaking to each one of them. So he was very much involved in the music that was being made. People were making music for him, and he was presenting it in his specific way. He is definitely a DJ that had a massive community of listeners around him as well. It was quite an inward-looking thing, but it was all the better for that.
And what about that kind of relationship between the listeners and the fans and the producers with a DJ like Youngsta? It chimes with you and what you've been doing with Hessle, for example, and your radio shows.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been doing radio for 7 years now. Pretty much 7 years solid. On 2 separate stations, initially on Sub FM, which was internet-based dubstep and garage, and assorted UK music station, now on Rinse, which was Pirate for 16 years, has had a community license in East London for the last 3 or 4. I mean, it's probably the single most valuable thing, I think, in terms of me building up a career as a DJ. And someone that plays in clubs. The radio shows absolutely do inform what I do in clubs, because I think it feels surprising to me, but I think it should have been obvious all along. Like, when you play in clubs week in, week out, you're playing to very different crowds in very different places, and it can, I think, confuse, and it can make you question, I think, what it is that you're looking for in the music that you're playing to people. The responses can be so wildly different that I think it can make you question your own responses to music a little bit. With the radio, I'm playing to the same crowd of listeners more or less every week. There's obviously people driving around London listening to the show who don't write in and stuff, and that's like a thing that I really like about playing on Rinse. But I really like the fact as well that the same people write into the show week in, week out, listening to the music that I'm playing, telling me what they think of it, telling me what they like, occasionally what they don't like. But yeah, it roots what I'm doing. I think it gives me a grounding that I wouldn't have otherwise. I think if I was just like floating around clubs every week, playing this music to people, I would probably feel a bit lost, to be honest.
Yeah, feeling lost and having roots and all those kind of words, it really hits home how a specialist DJ with a core group of listeners and a fan base for clubbing, the kind of people that will follow you around, as a DJ as opposed to a producer, it gives electronic music a home, quite literally. And that specialism about having somewhere to have the music that you play live is really interesting. I was actually wondering, on like a slight tangent to that as well, if we could play a little bit of something off your Fabric Live mix CD, and also explain a little bit about how that came around and the residency.
As a label, we have a residency at the Club Fabric in London, which has just celebrated 15 years of being open. They're another massive institution that somehow inexplicably decided to give us a slot really, really early on, and have kind of built us up over the past few years. As the label has grown, they've given us slightly more prominent slots at the club. We now take over the main room 3 times a year, and for the past 2, we've done one of these, and we will be doing very soon, takeovers of the entire building, which were always really, really fun. Their CD series is, I think, like probably one of the few remaining relatively successful mix CD series. One of the few that hasn't decided just to go with internet podcasts. I'm not really sure what the significance of that is, but for me, at least, it was an opportunity to spend a really, really long time trying to hone something, trying to craft something, I guess. The clip that I'm playing is hopefully representative of the kind of thing that I really like hearing and that I try and do. the 3 tracks are from relatively different areas, and sonically they're quite disparate as well. But I think they work really beautifully together. I'm not really sure what it is about the 3 tunes that work so well together, but I think played together they have something that individually they don't.
Now you can actually clap for Ben UFO for that one, because he did mix that one. I think that's the most meditative I've seen the room to date, so yeah, that's good. It's a fantastic mix. We're in danger of listening to half the thing at that point. But what I find really interesting about you, the idea of being a DJ's DJ and you not producing as part of Hessle, but you are representing much more than just your skill by having a label and by being so invested. With a mix series like Fabric Live, most people who do it are producers who also happen to be DJs, so it's a way to promote their own music as well as show off their skill. When you don't have your own music in there, what do you consider is your work when you're doing a mix like that?
I guess just the full package. Like I said, I think doing a mix CD is an opportunity for a DJ to spend some time honing something and crafting it, away from any of the pressures that might come from generally playing to an audience, which I think just naturally results in you making a different thing. I think the way that I've approached recording podcasts and CDs like this is probably much closer to me getting towards the kind of specialism that we were talking about before than I have done on the radio and in clubs. I think, again, it's because it's an opportunity to try and really look closely at something and try and achieve a particular feel. Hopefully you agree that those particular tunes work really well together and lend each other something that they wouldn't have otherwise. I think that's always what I've been interested in about DJing, is how certain DJs can make you feel very particular things that you might not have felt before about certain tunes that you might be familiar with already. DJs like Youngster definitely did that to me, and DJs like Optimo, DJs that sum up the kind of positive eclecticism that we were talking about before, do that to me as well. That's a slightly more achievable kind of aspiration for me, I think, to aspire towards someone like Optimo, or trying to think of other examples at the moment, but they're not coming to me.
For the sake of context, could you explain a little bit about Optimo and why you like them so much and what they mean to you?
Sure. They are two DJs from Glasgow, Keith and Johnny. Been going for a long time, put out a series of absolutely unbelievable mix CDs. That was my first introduction to them. CDs which are quite often themed around a certain sound, but are sonically super disparate. They find ways of putting together loads and loads of different kinds of music under similar stylistic banners somehow, and it is purely in the way that they do it, their skill as DJs, that's what makes it achievable for them. That's something that I really admire.
Yeah. So in the sense of the Fabric Live mix CD being an example of your work, it also is about putting yourself out there without your own music to back it up, as it were. But what is interesting is when a producer and a DJ together has a mythological kind of feel to them, that there's this very innate combination of factors that make somebody really special. And I know that somebody that really represents that for you is a man called Spencer Kinsey. I think it would be really good to have a little bit of a background about why that particular DJ means a lot to you.
I think I brought him up in conversation, and I have done interviews a few times, because he really represents what I was talking about before in terms of someone who managed to live within a scene in a certain context whilst also sort of picking apart the established conventions of that scene. He's actually someone that was really crucial and actually quite reassuring for me as someone that was getting into DJing house and techno. His style of mixing and the sort of adventurousness of his production as well, but mostly his style of mixing gave me reassurance that you could play house and techno with energy, that I could mix records together in a way that came naturally to me, like, you know, in a kind of UK style, quickly with sort of, I don't know, quite a hands-on feel to the mixer. He means a lot to me for that reason, I guess. It's one particular mix of his actually that sort of made me feel as though I could actually contribute something to house and techno just by DJing.
And that's quite a lot for one mix to do. But.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long mix, but yeah.
Shall we hear a bit of that mix so people get a sense of what you mean? So.
Sure. I mean, it's a completely different thing to anything that I've played so far. It's a really bad recording as well. It's like really saturated, and it sounds like there's some really weird kind of tape compression stuff going on. And the mixing's not even particularly tight as well, but as someone from the UK that was interested in like garage and dubstep, that's not really been anything that's ever bothered me particularly. Check it out.
just before you say anything, one thing that's really struck me, I didn't, apart from your Fabric Live mix, which I have heard, I hadn't heard those two mixes before enough to remember how they run anyway. And what's really struck me about playing all three of them in a sequence is that Youngsters was for radio, yours was recorded and released, and that sounded like very much like a club recording. And I think what all three managed to speak to is that there are different homes for electronic music. There's no, I don't know what you think of this, and maybe this could be a segue into this, but when people say this is dance music you can listen to at home, dance music for the club, dance music for the radio, I think bracketing these off as a listener isn't very helpful, and it probably isn't very helpful for you as a DJ. I don't know what you think about that, and in what kind of context you think your work is most applicable to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I completely agree. I think boundaries are useful and kind of essential. I mean, I definitely agree in part that things like music having very, very specific purposes is sort of, I mean, I'd never describe a track that I would play as like purely a club track or like purely a radio track. So in that sense, I agree with you. But also, I mean, music is contextual, and like certain music is designed for certain contexts. Certain music functions particularly well in certain contexts, and I think it would be slightly odd as a DJ playing music to people if you didn't take that into account. When I play really big parties, I definitely approach them differently to the thing I did last night with Nobu, which was absolutely tiny. In a context like that, where you've got people staring right at you, right with you, I think like music is so much more tangible in that kind of context. It's so much more immediate, and you can get away with so much more on a big stage, where particularly if you're DJing and not sticking your hand in the air and stuff, what you're actually doing up there isn't particularly visually obvious. A lot more gets lost, and I think, yeah, it would be weird not to take that into account. That's one side of it. The other side of it is that those kinds of dynamics have led to there being quite established ways of performing from space to space. There are certain sort of tropes and conventions that you hear again and again if you go big room raving, because there is certain stuff that will trigger thousands of people to put their hands in the air and stuff. That kind of thing isn't particularly something that I'm interested in. I mean, I obviously do play into that a little bit, because there is something really nice about performing to a lot of people that are sort of simultaneously like showing you that they're having a good time. But I'm quite interested in trying to achieve that sense of unity in a big space by doing something a little bit different and trying to work around those conventions a bit as well. I mean, that's why I continue to play in both kinds of space. Because it's not that one thing informs the other, because playing in big rooms doesn't inform playing in small spaces at all. But continuing to play in small spaces and being inside of the crowd as much as possible, like, is something that I think will stay really, really important to what I do. It gives you an idea of how something slightly more specialist might translate when you try and do it to more people.
Yeah. And it's also interesting when you consider how the world of clubbing, and the fact that I even use the phrase "the world of clubbing" is probably quite indicative of what I'm about to say, is that in the past 5, 6, 7 years, clubbing has become a recreational thing to do. It's like eating or exercising. People go clubbing on the weekends, whether they particularly like music or not. It's become a hobby that's very accepted. Whereas once clubbing was a mix of escapism, a political, sexual, radical space to experience something out with your norm. Now that clubbing very much is part of millions of people's norms, it is a $1 billion industry. There are entire, islands devoted to the activity, pretty much. I'm wondering, you as styled as an underground DJ, as it were, you are now presented with all these different spaces to play with in what is now a $1 billion industry. How do you see how you've played over the past 5 years in tandem with this enormous growth of what is now clubbing culture?
It's difficult to pick my own experience and my own trajectory apart from sort of general trends and stuff like that, but I do think that underground music in particular it's been really successfully monetized. Basically, it seems like a much bigger industry to me than it was, and I don't know if that's partly to do with me playing different music and finding myself involved with scenes that are more established and have more established sort of means of promoting itself and stuff like that. But I don't think that's the whole of it. I mean, the festival circuit is a really, really good example of something that's absolutely sort of just gone completely crazy recently. And there's absolutely enormous amounts of money involved in some of these bigger organisations as well. I don't know if that impacts on the way that I approach DJing. I mean, it does mean that I've found myself playing in spaces to a lot of people, the majority of whom don't know who I am. So I guess that does have an impact on the way I play and the way I DJ. But equally, it's something that sort of gives me even more of a reason to, try and play some of the weirder stuff as well. It's because it's a platform to do that. And I do enjoy, working around, whatever problem I'm faced with, whether, playing bizarre techno records to 2,000 people or something. It's like a fun challenge. It's really fun thinking of ways to try and get away with doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And then in turn, you must have tried to present music in settings that are not conventional dance floor spaces. It's quite interesting how this kind of circuit means that you are regularly gigging around the world at a time when, for example, like the youngsters of dubstep just at Forward or DMZ and then Spencer Kinsey would have been in a very particular time and place. You're playing very underground music across the world. Are there any particular examples recently where you felt that it has and hasn't worked to your benefit?
Yeah, I'm sure there. I've had my share of bad gigs, as have most DJs. There was one particularly memorable festival set when I wasn't particularly experienced with them. I'd been put on a stage closing after, I think, 3 or 4 French hip-hop acts. A lot of people, about 3,000 people. I'd never seen that amount of people before in my life. I've never seen before or since as many people walk away from me as quickly either. It was really awful. 200 or 300 people stuck around, but that's 2,500 people leaving all at once. It's quite a lot.
It's a bit of a knock.
Yeah, totally. But it's it's an experience. I think I sort of overcame that hurdle eventually. I don't know. I think traveling, playing in different contexts, it does have a really big impact on the way that you experience the music that you play. I think that was something that affected the trajectory of dubstep and how it developed. The problems that it faced translating itself to bigger spaces from those small rooms. that essentially was the thing that eventually killed my interest in it. Because the things it had to do, or the things that it ended up doing, it became a completely different thing. Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm getting at particularly.
It's all right.
I think we were talking about how this music has been sort of monetized really effectively, and how there are more massive spaces than ever with which to sort of perform and show your music to people. I think seeing what happened with dubstep, seeing what happened with drum and bass before it, it's given me a really good idea of like what I would like to avoid, and that really informs how I think we approach the music that we release on Hessle. We want to release music that functions in big spaces, but that still manages to have something different, something alien about it. So music that is linked to, I guess, like sort of big room dance floor tropes and stuff, but that somehow skirts around it, that manages to kind of work effectively and engage people, but to do it in a slightly different way. And it's really satisfying when you see a lot of people sort of react in shock to something that they weren't expecting. I think you end up getting some really interesting moments that way. People start interacting with each other differently. It's really nice when you see that happen. I mean, the last record that we released is, I think, the best example of that. I'm really happy with it. It's the first record that we've released in a year, and I think one of the reasons that it took us so long was that we've been trying really hard to think of ways to approach this kind of problem, making weird music accessible to lots of people.
Well, have you got an example of what we could play?
So the last record we released is by a guy called Bruce. We've picked a lot of producers that have really straightforward names. Yeah. His real name is Larry, actually.
I just assumed he was called Bruce, but you know.
I don't think it's public knowledge. It is now.
Yeah.
So this is Not Stochastic off Hessle 27. Yeah, see what you think. I don't know why.
When you're speaking about surprises on the dance floor, that actually did stop me in my tracks. I thought it was, so I guess it served its purpose. What's really interesting about that track is that we've kind of actually managed to bookmark this really nicely, because we started with Hessle, we had a little bit of more Hessle, and then we're finishing with kind of the future of Hessle. When we're talking about dance music presented in all these different contexts, the radio, the club, the mix, the official mix CD release, you having to play in all these different clubs all over the world, big festival stages, it seems like an endless list of what could and could not work. What is it with that track in particular, and what you would like to do with Hessle going forward, that you feel can speak to these different situations and, put across your ideas of what you like to do as a DJ?
So again, I guess, like I said, this tune is something that it kind of messes around with established big room techno tropes. Like, it involves white noise drops and all these kinds of things that everyone would have heard a million times. But structurally, it's all over the place. It's really bizarre. It's been put together in a really specifically and purposefully awkward way, like awkward particularly from a DJing perspective, which is something that I'm kind of up for. But yeah, I think it really works. It definitely stops people in their tracks, like you said, and it's this is the kind of thing that I'm interested in releasing on the label. It's not that we're being awkward for the sake of it, or that we're taking ourselves away from established dance floor tropes. That's not what I want to do at all. With the label, and with my DJing too, I want to work within these conventions, because they're there for a reason. They work, and dance music needs to function in a space. But the label for me has always been informed by our perspective initially as being outsiders. And I still feel that way now, and I feel like that's why why we continue to be interested in releasing these records that come from a kind of outsider perspective. And yeah, that fully informs my DJing.
I think that's gone on for an hour and a half. I would like to ask if anybody has any questions for Ben. Oh, good. Oh, wow, amazing. Lots of people wanting to ask questions. Can we just give a hand for Ben speaking so nicely for us? Great.
Hey, yeah, last night was amazing, and I'm a DJ too, and listening to that the third mixtape, for me is overwhelming when I hear a DJ that I really, really like, and that it's and you said that made you wanting to put something there that made you trust that you could add something to a techno scene or whatever. And for me, listening to that kind of mixtape just makes me feel the opposite way. Because what can I add to listening to so many good DJs around, and trying not to, because I think I have found a path in two ways, trying to see why I like them and trying to, I don't know, kind of copy some vibe, or just doing the opposite. Because my question is, how have you found that thing you are trusting that you can do for adding some your place in that scene?
It's a good question, and I definitely sympathise, because back in the day when I was listening to dubstep DJs and jungle DJs, I very much did feel like that. Why would I bother sort of thinking that I could put myself out there when there's all these guys doing what they do so well? But but I think what was different about the Spencer Kinsey mix, which I actually played the wrong clip from. I'd found a really good clip that involved loads of like spinbacks and like UK sounds and stuff, but I played the wrong one. But it was my lack of familiarity, I think, with the scene at that point that made me feel as though I could contribute something to it. If I'd known more about house and techno, more about the history of the music, I might have felt more cautious. It would have felt more difficult to approach, just because, like you said, I might have felt overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that was already there. But at the time, I hadn't heard anyone really mix like him, and he's not active at the moment. Hopefully, I'm not kind of wholesale ripping him off, but like, I think like being influenced by somebody's approach, if you don't hear anyone else with that approach out there at the time, is kind of fine. I guess also like kind of something that would probably be more reassuring, I guess, is that I think just the longer you do what you do, as long as you're kind of self-critical and stuff, you just inevitably do end up progressing in a slightly different direction to most of the people that will have initially influenced you. I think that can't help but happen. I think that's what happened with me anyway. I don't think you should let it put you off. I'm glad there are some DJs in the audience, I was wondering.
Thank you.
Yeah, just pass it along, I guess. Yeah.
Hello. I had a question that has not been discussed actually today, and I'm talking to you as a label owner which releases vinyl, and I have a question about like the medium that you share your music with, and I'm sure you also own quite a few records of yours. What was the reason back when you created Hessle Audio for this medium, which is vinyl, and what is the reason now to just continue doing it?
I think there's kind of a few different reasons for that. Like, for me, I find the amount of digital music that's released now completely overwhelming, to the point where if I go onto a digital store and click releases from this week, I can't get through the first page. I've barely got through the first half of the A's before I stop. So from that perspective, I think it's just a filter, which everyone needs. There's so much music out there that everyone needs filters, and those filters can be DJs and record labels and stuff as well. But it can also be your choice of format. I don't limit myself to just buying vinyl, but I do find that it's released in manageable quantities so that I can actually check out everything that comes out. We started the label as a vinyl label for different reasons, though. I think it was literally just because everyone else was doing it. Like, we were fans of a certain scene, and that was how that scene did it. So that's how we wanted to do it as well. Most of the DJs that we were going to see were playing on vinyl and dubplate at the time. We wanted to be able to give them our records so that they could listen to them and maybe play them. That was the reason for that. I think we continue to do it just because it's nice to have an artifact. It's nice to have a sort of physical reminder of what you've done.
Thank you. Totally agree.
It's not format purism at all. It's like I'm not interested in that, but it's just from a personal perspective. Like, we like having records. They're tangible.
Anyone else? Oh, at the end.
Hello. You kind of touched on this a little bit with bridging, the marketplace or the musical climate with alien music, you know what I mean? How you're trying to spread it. As a person who, I guess, is responsible for spreading music as a label and as a DJ, in the reverse question, do you ever have any conscious dilemmas or make conscious efforts to limit that spread, or try and preserve the trajectory of a niche movement that you love or championing?
Definitely. It's something that I'm more conscious of now than I was this time last year. Definitely, there was this whole like debacle around outside a house as a thing, which
I actually made a point of not going to bring that up, so you brought it up. So
yeah, it's my own fault. I guess over the past 18 months or something, there's been like a whole wave of like really interesting producers that are making house and techno. That like broadly sounds quite lo-fi, and that doesn't play into a lot of the dance floor conventions that have established around house and techno. The Hardwax record shop uses the word outsider to describe anything that is slightly kind of other, but still fits within a kind of genre boundary. And I made a sort of crack on the radio about this stuff being outside house, and someone wrote an article about it, and ever since then that's been its name, and that's how it's been described in the media. And like, I mean, a lot of people are doing it in like a super tongue-in-cheek way, but it's still something that I think has generally had quite a negative impact on the music and a lot of people's production careers, because they found themselves kind of pigeonholed into this one specific style. That kind of pigeonholing is really convenient if you're trying to sell music, or if you're trying to sell an idea, sell a night, sell an event. But I think it's not particularly helpful a lot of the time when a lot of the, for the producers when they're 17, 18, 19 years old and just getting started. So in that respect, I've definitely thought about whether, for certain musics, whether or not it's appropriate to really play into the kind of hype machine.
Cool, thanks.
Hi Ben, thank you for your inspiring work. And I got a question for producers, actually. Speaking of awkward structures, I'm a producer and totally not a DJ. So I often, when I compose my tracks, I like to build peculiar and strange narratives and still make club music somehow. The question is, when you meet a track that has a really awkward structure, I mean, maybe BPM changes or no hints of the timing, or I mean, you can imagine.
It sounds difficult.
Okay, yeah, that's the question. If the track is good, you're still playing it.
I mean, are you making your music for DJs to play? Is that the idea?
Well, I'd like to.
Yeah. I think you shouldn't let it put you off making the music that you want to make, but it might be difficult. I think for me and people that share my background, we, even though I play quite a few different styles of music, most of the music that I play comes from a particular scene. And those scenes are defined by people working within quite specific structural guidelines and stuff, I guess. So particular time signatures, particular tempos. And there are people who really successfully manage to kind of swerve those and still manage to get their music played. But I think if you're doing something that is sort of really specifically yours and that doesn't have a kind of network of producers, DJs and a scene around it, I think that kind of really intense structural awkwardness might be a bit of a problem.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, do you have DJs and producers around you, like a circle of people that you're making music with?
Yeah, totally. And they actually play my music, which is maybe not that awkward like I made you imagine right now. I mean, I'm totally conscious of what kind of guidelines, let's say, genres are suggesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, working around them, it's actually pretty interesting for me that I'm not a DJ again. So it's like working around rules. So that's inspiring.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for the answer.
Thanks.
Is there anyone else? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for probably speaking for the longest on camera you've probably ever done. I really
By
appreciate
far, yeah.
Yeah, by far. And thank you for just all your work. So, Ben UFO, everybody.